Welcome to Live Podcast as we journey through the Bible. Today we are in Acts chapter 27, and here we see Paul sailing to Rome. So when the time came, it says we set sail for Italy. So it looks like Luke set sail together with Paul. Paul and several other prisoners were placed in the custody of a Roman officer named Julius, a captain of the imperial regiment. And then Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was also with us. Aristarchus is also mentioned in as a companion of Paul in chapter 19, verse 29, during the riot in Ephesus. So we left on a ship whose home port was, this is a very hard name, Adramyttium. I don't know if I'm mentioning this correctly, but Adramyttium, on the northwest coast of the province of Asia. It was scheduled to make several stops at ports along the coast of the province. The next day, when we docked at Sidon, Julius was very kind to Paul. Julius was the captain of the imperial regiment. He was very kind to Paul and let him go ashore to visit with friends so they could provide for his needs. How nice of him. I don't know if the Bible does not record if Paul was bound or anything, but it does record that he let him go ashore to visit with friends so they could provide for his needs. Putting out to sea from there, we encountered strong headwinds that made it difficult to keep the ship on course. So we sailed north of Cyprus between the island and the mainland, keeping to the open sea. We passed along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, landing at Myra in the province of Lycia. There, the commanding officer found an Egyptian ship from Alexandria that was bound for Italy, and he put us on board. So they changed ships. We had several days of slow sailing, and after great difficulty, we finally neared Cnidus. But the wind was against us, so we sailed across to Crete and along the sheltered coast of the island, past the Cape of Salmon. We struggled along the coast with great difficulty and finally arrived at Fair Havens near the town of Lycia. We had lost a lot of time. The weather was becoming dangerous for sea travel because it was so late in fall. And Paul spoke to the ship's officers about it. Life Application Bible Study actually says ships in ancient times had no compasses, so they navigated by the stars. Overcast weather made sailing almost impossible and very dangerous. Sailing was doubtful in September and impossible by November. This event occurred in October AD 59. So that's what the Life Application Bible Study says. And then, so Paul tells him, "Men," he said, "I believe there is trouble ahead if we go on. Shipwreck." So Paul is telling the officers that if you go on like this, we'll get trouble and we're going to be shipwrecked. Loss of cargo and danger of our lives as well. But the officer in charge of the prisoners listened more to the ship's captain and the owner than to Paul, so they ignored him. And since Fair Havens was an exposed harbor, a poor place to spend the winter, most of the crew wanted to go on to Phoenix, further up the coast of Crete, and spend the winter there. Phoenix was a good harbor with only a southwest and northwest exposure. And then from verse 13, we see a storm. When a light wind began blowing from the south, the sailors thought they could make it. So they pulled up anchor and sailed close to the shore of Crete. But the weather changed abruptly, and a wind of typhoon strength, called a northeaster, burst across the island and blew us out of sea. The sailors couldn't turn the ship into the wind, so they gave up and let it run before the gale. We sailed along the sheltered side of a small island named Cauda, where with great difficulty we hoisted aboard the lifeboats the lifeboat being towed behind us. Then the sailors bound ropes around the hull of the ship to strengthen it. Bounding ropes was passing ropes under the ship to hold it all together. They were afraid of being driven across to the sandbars of CITES of the African coast. So they lowered the sea anchor to slow the ship and were driven before the wind. The next day, as gale force winds continued to batter the ship, the crew began throwing the cargo overboard. The following day, they even took some of the ship's gear and threw it overboard. The terrible storm raged for many days, blotting out the sun and the stars until at last all hope was gone. Now, no one had eaten for a long time. Finally, Paul called the crew together and said, "Men, you should have listened to me in the first place." Remember, he had told them not to go in that direction because of shipwreck. So he says, "You should have listened to me in the first place and not left Crete. You would have avoided all this damage and loss. But take courage. None of you will lose your lives, even though the ship will go down." So Paul is like, no one will die, but the ship will go down. "For last night an angel of the Lord, to whom I belong and whom I serve, stood beside me and said, 'Don't be afraid, Paul, for you will surely stand trial before Caesar. What's more, God in his goodness and has granted safety to everyone sailing with you. So take courage, for I believe God, it will be just as he said, but we will be shipwrecked on an island.'" So the angel of the Lord appeared to Paul and told him that everyone is going to be okay and he will still stand trial before Caesar. And he shouldn't be afraid, but to be encouraged. And so that is what Paul did. He encouraged everyone else who was on board. And then from verse 27, we actually see the shipwreck happen. About midnight on the 14th night of the storm, so the storm was on for 14 nights, as we were being driven across the Sea of Adria, this is the Mediterranean Sea, the sailors sensed land was near. They dropped a weighted line and found that the water was about 120 feet deep. But a little later, they measured again and found it was only 90 feet deep. At this rate, they were afraid they would soon be driven against the rocks along the shore. So they threw out 4 anchors from the back of the ship and prayed for daylight. Then the sailors tried to abandon the ship. They lowered the lifeboat as though they were going to put out anchors from the front of the ship. But Paul said to the commanding officer and to the soldiers, "You will all die unless the sailors stay aboard." So the soldiers cut the ropes to the lifeboat and let it drift away. Just as day was dawning, Paul urged everyone to eat. "You have been so worried that you haven't touched your food for 2 weeks," he said. "Please eat something now for your own good, for not a hair of your heads will perish." So here we see Paul becoming an encourager to the people that were with him. Then he took some bread, gave thanks to God before them all, and broke off a piece and ate it. Then everyone was encouraged and began to eat, all 276 of them who were on board. After eating, the crew lightened the ship further by throwing the cargo of wheat overboard. When morning dawned, they didn't recognize the coastline, but they saw a bay with a beach and wondered if they could get to shore by running the ship aground. So they cut off the anchors and left them in the sea. Then they lowered the rudders, raised the foresail, and headed toward shore. But they hit a shoal. A shoal is a large number of fish swimming together. So they hit a shoal of fish and ran the ship aground too soon. The bow of the ship struck fast, while the stern was repeatedly smashed by the force of the waves and began to break apart. So the soldiers wanted to kill all the prisoners to make sure they didn't swim ashore and escape. But the commanding officer wanted to spare Paul, so he didn't let them carry out their plan. Then he ordered all who could swim to jump overboard first and make for land. and the others held on to planks or debris from the broken ship. So everyone escaped safely to shore. And that was Acts chapter 27, in which we read 44 verses with so many lessons. What are these? We see that Luke sailed with Paul because he writes, "We set sail" in verse 1. Paul was assigned a place in custody of Julius, a Roman officer who was kind. He gave him freedom to visit his friends at Sidon to provide for his needs, and he spared Paul's life in verse 43. The ship had 276 passengers in total. Paul warned them of the direction they took in verse 10. They didn't listen, but in verse 30 to 32, they listened and they were saved. They listened to what Paul was saying. The people would be safe because of Paul. And this goes to show us that God will save others just because they are with you and because you know Him. And then the people prayed and also took action of drawing the four anchors, prayer plus action that was put into practice. In the midst of chaos, Paul became an encourager to the people he was with, all 276 people. We too should emulate this and become encouragers even in calamity. They all escaped safely to shore, just as Paul had said. God's word came to pass. So we're done with Acts chapter 27, and I will see you again tomorrow as we read Acts 28, in which we see Paul and his companions on the island of Malta, and he arrives in Rome. God bless you.